Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in Mobile, Alabama history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing to what places and at what moments of the day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1846, Mobile County, Alabama, bore witness to events that would forever alter the understanding of human nature within the confines of plantation society. The case of Isaac Thornton and the Bellemare family represents one of the most psychologically complex incidents ever documented in the antebellum South, where the boundaries between power, obsession, and manipulation became so blurred that even today, historians struggle to separate truth from the elaborate web of deception that unfolded. If you're enjoying the story and feel like helping the channel with any amount, please support us by clicking the thanks button and donating whatever you wish. This really helps the channel keep posting new stories. The Bellemare plantation sat on 1,200 acres of fertile delta land, approximately 8 miles northeast of Mobile proper, where the Tensor River curved through ancient cypress groves. The main house, a 2-story Greek Revival structure with 6 white columns, commanded a view of cotton fields that stretched beyond the horizon. In 1846, the plantation was home to Cornelius Bellemare, a man of 43 years who had inherited the property from his father, and his wife Lucinda, 28 years of age, whose delicate beauty had made her the subject of admiration throughout Mobile County since her arrival from Charleston 7 years earlier. Among the 137 enslaved people who worked the Bellemare land was Isaac Thornton, purchased in 1844 from a estate sale in Montgomery. The bill of sale, discovered years later in courthouse records, described him as 26 years old, of mixed heritage, possessed of unusual intelligence and bearing what the auctioneer termed remarkable physical attributes. What the document failed to capture was the magnetic quality that would eventually draw the attention of both master and mistress in ways that defied the rigid social order of the time. The first indication that something was amiss came through the observations of Ezekiel Marsh, an overseer who had managed various plantations throughout southern Alabama for nearly 2 decades. In a letter to his brother in Montgomery, dated October 15, 1846, Marsh wrote that the new field hand showed an unusual familiarity with the main house, often being summoned for tasks that typically fell outside the scope of agricultural labor. More troubling to Marsh was the frequency with which these summons came directly from Mrs. Bellemare, bypassing the established chain of command that governed plantation operations. The Bellemare household, prior to Isaac's arrival, had operated with the mechanical precision typical of successful cotton plantations. Cornelius maintained strict schedules, rising before dawn to inspect the fields, reviewing account books each evening by lamplight. Lucinda occupied herself with the management of the domestic staff, correspondence with family in Charleston, and the elaborate social obligations that defined her position as one of Mobile County's most prominent plantation wives. Their marriage, arranged by their respective families, functioned as a business partnership wrapped in the veneer of Southern gentility. The domestic staff, consisting of 8 enslaved individuals who worked within the main house, operated under the supervision of Minerva, a woman in her 50s who had served the Bellemare family since childhood. According to testimony given years later during legal proceedings, Minerva first noticed changes in the household dynamics during the final weeks of October 1846. Mrs. Bellemare began requesting that Isaac be assigned to indoor repairs, despite the presence of other enslaved men more experienced in carpentry and maintenance work. The architecture of the Bellemare house played a crucial role in what followed. The structure featured a central hallway that ran from front to back, with parlors and dining rooms on the first floor and bedrooms on the second. A narrow staircase led to the third floor, which contained storage rooms and quarters for house servants. Most significantly, the house included a hidden chamber, accessible through a concealed panel in the master bedroom's wall, originally constructed as a safe room during the Creek War of 1813 through 14. Dr. Silas Morton, the family physician who attended to the Belmars, noted in his personal journal that during a routine visit in early November 1846, he observed what he described as an unusual restlessness in Mrs. Belmare. Her complexion appeared heightened, her speech rapid, and she demonstrated an uncharacteristic interest in the activities of the field hands, asking detailed questions about their health and capabilities. Dr. Morton, who had known Lucinda since her arrival in Mobile County, found this behavior sufficiently concerning to mention it in correspondence with his colleague Dr. James Whitfield in Montgomery. The transformation became more apparent to those who worked closely within the household. Martha, a young woman who served as Lucinda's personal attendant, later testified that her mistress began spending long periods in the library, a room she had previously visited only briefly. More peculiar was Lucinda's sudden fascination with the account books that detailed the plantation's human property, requesting to review information about individual enslaved people, their skills, and their personal histories. Isaac Thornton's background, as pieced together from various plantation records and sale documents, revealed a complex history. Born on a tobacco plantation in Virginia, he had been sold 3 times before arriving at the Montgomery estate where the Belmars acquired him. Previous owners had noted his ability to read and write, skills that were both valuable and dangerous in an enslaved person. The Montgomery estate's records indicated that Isaac had served as a driver, overseeing other enslaved workers, a position that required intelligence and the ability to navigate the complex power dynamics of plantation society. The physical description of Isaac Thornton, found in multiple documents, painted a picture of a man whose appearance set him apart from others. Standing over 6 feet tall, with what one bill of sale described as features that combined European and African heritage, in a manner that was both striking and unsettling to those who encountered him. Several accounts mentioned his ability to speak with precision and intelligence that made overseers and masters uncomfortable, suggesting a man who understood far more about his circumstances than was safe for someone in his position. Cornelius Bellomar's own writings, discovered in a trunk decades later, provide insight into his perspective during this period. In entries dating from November 1846, he recorded growing concerns about his wife's behavior, noting that she had begun taking long walks around the plantation grounds, often accompanied by only 1 or 2 enslaved attendants. More troubling to Cornelius was Lucinda's increasing criticism of his management decisions, particularly regarding the treatment and assignment of individual enslaved people. The social structure of Mobile County in 1846 operated according to rigid hierarchies that governed every aspect of daily life. Plantation families like the Bellamars were expected to maintain not only economic success, but also social respectability that reflected their position within the community. Any deviation from accepted norms could result in social ostracism that would affect both business relationships and family standing throughout the region. The Baptist Church records from Oak Grove Baptist Church, where the Belmars worshipped, indicate that during November and December of 1846, the family's attendance became irregular. Previously, the Belmars had occupied their designated pew every Sunday, participating in the social gatherings that followed services. Reverend Samuel Crawford noted in his pastoral journal that when the family did attend, Mrs. Belmare appeared distracted, often staring out the windows during sermons and showing little interest in conversations with other plantation wives. The neighboring planters began to notice subtle changes in the Bellemare plantation's operations. Augustus Pembroke, whose property adjoined the Bellemare land to the east, observed in a letter to his brother-in-law that the cotton harvest seemed to be proceeding more slowly than in previous years. More significantly, Pembroke noted that he had observed unusual activity around the Bellemare house during evening hours, with lights visible in rooms that were typically unoccupied after sunset. The merchant records from Mobile provide additional context for the events unfolding at the plantation. Theodore Hutchinson, who supplied dry goods to many of the county's prominent families, noted in his ledger that Mrs. Bellemare's purchasing patterns had changed dramatically. Instead of the typical orders for household necessities and feminine accessories, she began requesting books, writing materials, and items that suggested an interest in subjects far beyond the normal scope of a plantation mistress's concerns. The enslaved community at Bellemare Plantation operated according to its own complex social structure, with informal leaders who maintained order and communication among the various work groups. According to testimony gathered during later legal proceedings, many of the enslaved people had noticed Isaac Thornton's elevated status within the plantation hierarchy. But the exact nature of his relationship with the Bellemare family remained a subject of speculation and whispered conversations in the quarters. Dr. Morton's medical records provide a clinical perspective on the deteriorating situation. During a visit in December 1846, he prescribed laudanum for Mrs. Bellemare's increasing nervousness and inability to sleep. His notes indicate that she complained of nightmares and an overwhelming sense that she was being watched, even when alone in her room. Dr. Morton's concern was heightened by Lucinda's refusal to explain the source of her distress, stating only that she felt trapped by circumstances beyond her control. The winter months brought a change in the plantation's routine that was observed by multiple witnesses. The evening meals, previously formal affairs that followed a strict schedule, became irregular. Cornelius often dined alone, with Lucinda claiming illness or fatigue. The house servants reported that Mrs. Bellemare frequently requested meals to be brought to the library, where she spent increasing amounts of time behind closed doors. The documentary evidence from this period includes a series of letters exchanged between Lucinda and her sister Margaret in Charleston. These letters, discovered during the settlement of the estate, reveal a woman struggling with psychological pressures that she could not openly discuss. Lucinda wrote of feeling isolated despite being surrounded by people, of dreams that seemed more real than her waking hours, and of a growing certainty that her life was following a path that would lead to destruction. The hidden chamber in the master bedroom became a focal point of the mysterious activities that characterized the plantation during the winter of 1846 through 47. House servants reported hearing voices and movement from behind the walls, but when questioned by the overseer, they claimed ignorance of the source. The chamber, originally designed as a refuge, had been forgotten by most of the household staff, making it an ideal location for activities that required absolute secrecy. Ezekiel Marsh's reports to Cornelius Bellemare during this period document a plantation in subtle decline. Work productivity decreased, discipline problems increased, and several enslaved people attempted to escape despite the harsh winter conditions. Marsh attributed these problems to what he termed a breakdown in the natural order that governed plantation society, though he could not identify the specific cause of the deterioration. The correspondence between Cornelius Bellemare and his cotton factor in Mobile reveals growing financial pressures that compounded the personal stress within the household. The 1846 harvest had been smaller than expected, and market prices for cotton were declining throughout the region. These economic concerns added another layer of tension to a situation that was already straining the foundations of the Bellemare family's carefully constructed social position. The turning point came during the first week of January 1847, when a series of events converged to shatter the precarious balance that had maintained the plantation's operations. A violent winter storm struck Mobile County, isolating the plantation from the outside world for nearly a week. During this period of enforced isolation, the psychological tensions that had been building for months finally reached a breaking point that would forever change the lives of everyone involved. The storm brought winds that stripped the remaining leaves from the ancient oak trees surrounding the main house, leaving their bare branches to scrape against the windows with a sound that house servants later described as resembling human voices. The temperature dropped below freezing, unusual for the region, forcing all plantation activities to halt while everyone sought shelter from the unprecedented cold. Dr. Morton's journal entry for January 8, 1847, describes arriving at the plantation as soon as the roads became passable, summoned by a message that spoke only of an urgent medical emergency. What he found was a household in a state of complete disarray, with the normal routines and hierarchies that governed plantation life apparently abandoned during the days of isolation. Mrs. Bellemare was discovered in the library, conscious but in a state of extreme agitation that Dr. Morton described as resembling a nervous collapse. She spoke rapidly of voices in the walls, of secrets that could not be revealed, and of a love that defied all natural law. Her physical condition suggested that she had not eaten or slept properly for several days, and her appearance shocked Dr. Morton, who had known her as one of the most composed women in Mobile County society. The search of the house that followed Dr. Morton's arrival revealed evidence of activities that contradicted every assumption about the Bellemare family's private life. In the hidden chamber behind the master bedroom, investigators found a collection of personal items that told a story of intimate relationships that violated every social and legal boundary of antebellum Alabama society. Among these items were letters written in Lucinda's hand, expressing emotions and desires that would have destroyed her reputation and endangered the lives of everyone involved. Isaac Thornton was discovered in the chamber, but his condition raised more questions than it answered. He appeared to have been confined there for an extended period, with evidence suggesting that his presence was both voluntary and coerced. His physical state indicated good care and adequate nourishment, but also signs of psychological stress that mirrored Mrs. Bellemare's condition. When questioned by Dr. Morton and the hastily assembled group of plantation owners who had been summoned to deal with the crisis, Isaac provided answers that seemed carefully rehearsed and deliberately incomplete. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of documents that appeared to detail a systematic plan for escape that went far beyond the simple desire for freedom that motivated most runaway slaves. These papers suggested a level of coordination and preparation that implied assistance from someone with intimate knowledge of the plantation's operations and the broader social and economic networks that connected Mobile County's elite families. Cornelius Bellemare's reaction to these discoveries was recorded by several witnesses, and their accounts paint a picture of a man whose carefully controlled world had collapsed around him. Rather than the expected rage or demands for immediate punishment, he exhibited what Dr. Morton described as an unnatural calm, as if he had been expecting these revelations. His questions focused not on the moral or legal implications of what had been discovered, but on the practical concerns of maintaining secrecy and protecting the family's reputation. The investigation that followed was conducted with the utmost discretion, involving only a select group of plantation owners and community leaders who understood the potential consequences of public exposure. The official records from this period, housed in the Mobile County Courthouse, contain only brief mentions of a disturbance at the Bellemare plantation that was resolved through private mediation. The true extent of what was discovered was never recorded in any public document. The enslaved community's knowledge of the situation became apparent through the testimony of several individuals who were questioned separately by the investigating committee. Their accounts revealed that Isaac Thornton's special status within the plantation hierarchy had been observed and discussed among the enslaved people for months. More significantly, several witnesses reported that other enslaved individuals had been aware of the hidden chamber's existence and had occasionally seen or heard evidence of its occupation. The role of the house servants in facilitating whatever relationship had developed between Mrs. Belmare and Isaac Thornton remained a subject of speculation and incomplete testimony. Minerva, the head house servant, maintained her innocence of any wrongdoing while acknowledging that she had been aware of unusual activities within the main house. Her position required a delicate balance between loyalty to the family she served and protection of the enslaved community under her supervision. The medical examination of both Mrs. Bellemare and Isaac Thornton, conducted by Dr. Morton with the assistance of Dr. Whitfield, who traveled from Montgomery at the request of the investigating committee, revealed physical evidence that supported some aspects of the discovered correspondence. However, the doctor's reports, which were sealed immediately after completion, apparently contained information that the investigating committee deemed too sensitive to include in even their private deliberations. The question of Cornelius Bellamare's knowledge of and possible participation in the events that had unfolded in his home became a central focus of the private investigation. His personal papers, examined by the committee, revealed a man who had been struggling with issues far more complex than the typical challenges of plantation management. Among his writings were philosophical reflections on the nature of human bondage, the arbitrary foundations of racial hierarchy, and the psychological costs of maintaining a system based on the complete subjugation of other human beings. The discovery of additional hidden spaces within the plantation house suggested that the activities centered around the concealed chamber were part of a larger pattern of secrecy that had characterized the Belmare household for an extended period. A thorough examination revealed that several rooms contained concealed compartments and hidden passages that could have facilitated clandestine movement throughout the house without detection by most of the household staff. The financial records examination provided another perspective on the events that had transpired. The plantation's books revealed irregular expenditures that could not be accounted for through normal operations, suggesting that considerable sums had been used for purposes that were not recorded in the standard accounting systems. These discrepancies implied a level of planning and resource allocation that contradicted the impression of spontaneous passion that had initially characterized the investigation's findings. The psychological evaluation of Mrs. Belmare, conducted through extended conversations with Dr. Morton, revealed a woman whose mental state had been deteriorating for a period much longer than the few months that had initially been suspected. Her accounts of the relationship with Isaac Thornton were inconsistent and contradictory, alternating between descriptions of coercion and willing participation, between expressions of love and claims of manipulation. The investigation into Isaac Thornton's background revealed discrepancies in his documented history that suggested his identity may have been deliberately obscured. Records from the Montgomery estate where he had been purchased indicated that he had arrived there under circumstances that were unusual for enslaved people, with documentation that seemed incomplete and possibly falsified. This discovery raised questions about whether his presence at the Belmare plantation was the result of careful planning rather than the routine business of human trafficking. The testimony of neighboring plantation owners provided context for evaluating the social and economic implications of the scandal. The consensus among Mobile County's elite was that public exposure of the events would have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate participants, potentially undermining the social structures that maintained order throughout the region. The decision to handle the matter privately reflected not only concern for the Belmar family's reputation, but also recognition of the broader threats that such a scandal could pose to the entire plantation system. The resolution of the immediate crisis involved a series of decisions that satisfied the practical concerns of the investigating committee while leaving many fundamental questions unanswered. Mrs. Bellemare was removed from the plantation to receive private medical care at an undisclosed location, with her condition described to the broader community as a nervous exhaustion brought on by the isolation and demands of plantation life. Isaac Thornton disappeared from the plantation's records, with his fate becoming one of the enduring mysteries surrounding the case. The sale of the Bellemare plantation, which occurred in March 1847, was handled through discreet negotiations that avoided public auction and the accompanying scrutiny that such sales typically attracted. Cornelius Bellemare relocated to Mobile proper, where he lived in relative obscurity until his death in 1852. His personal papers, discovered decades later, contain no references to the events of 1846 through 47, suggesting that he had deliberately destroyed any documentation that might have provided insight into his perspective on what had transpired. The fate of the enslaved community at Bellemare Plantation became scattered across multiple properties throughout southern Alabama and Mississippi. Several individuals who had been present during the crisis period were sold to plantations in remote areas, effectively eliminating potential witnesses to whatever had actually occurred. The systematic dispersal of these potential sources of information was noted by some observers as being unusually thorough, suggesting a coordinated effort to suppress knowledge of the events. The transformation of the plantation property itself reflected the desire to erase evidence of its troubled history. The new owners, a family from Savannah with no previous connections to Mobile County society, undertook extensive renovations that included sealing the hidden chambers and passages that had been discovered during the investigation. The main house was substantially altered, with the Greek Revival columns replaced by a simpler design that eliminated many of the architectural features that had characterized the Bellemare era. The medical records from Dr. Morton's treatment of Mrs. Bellemare, which continued for several years after her removal from the plantation, provide glimpses into the long-term psychological effects of whatever she had experienced. Her condition never fully stabilized, with periods of apparent recovery alternating with episodes of severe distress that seemed to be triggered by unpredictable stimuli. She died in 1851 at a private sanitarium in Tennessee, with her death certificate listing only general nervous exhaustion as the cause. The investigation into the financial irregularities discovered in the plantation's records revealed connections to a network of merchants, ship captains, and other individuals whose activities suggested involvement in operations that extended far beyond the normal business of cotton production and slave labor. These connections implied that the Bellemare plantation may have been part of a larger system of clandestine activities that operated throughout the Gulf Coast region during the 1840s. The discovery of similar hidden chambers and passages in other plantation houses throughout Mobile County, revealed during subsequent investigations in the 1850s and 60s, suggested that the architectural features found at the Bellemare property were not unique. This pattern implied a level of coordination among plantation families that contradicted the public image of isolated rural estates operating independently of one another. The role of the local church and religious community in responding to the crisis provided insight into the mechanisms through which antebellum society managed scandals that threatened its fundamental assumptions. Reverend Crawford's pastoral records indicate that he was informed of the general nature of the problem, but was specifically instructed to avoid any public reference to the events. His subsequent sermons during the spring of 1847 focused heavily on themes of temptation, hidden sin, and the importance of maintaining social order through adherence to divine law. The impact of the Belmare scandal on Mobile County society was measured not in public discussion, but in the subtle changes that occurred in the management and oversight of plantation operations throughout the region. Several families implemented new security measures and supervision protocols that suggested a heightened awareness of the potential for similar situations to develop elsewhere. These changes occurred without public explanation, indicating that knowledge of what had happened spread through private channels among the elite families who controlled the county's economic and social structures. The legal implications of the case were never fully explored through official channels, but private correspondence among lawyers and judges in the region indicates that the events raised fundamental questions about the application of existing laws to situations that challenged basic assumptions about race, power, and human relationships. The consensus among legal professionals was that prosecution would have required public testimony that could have had devastating effects on the stability of the entire social system. The attempts to trace Isaac Thornton's fate after his disappearance from the plantation yielded conflicting and ultimately inconclusive results. Some reports suggested that he had been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, while others indicated that he may have been transported to New Orleans for sale in the broader slave markets. The most intriguing possibility, suggested by several pieces of circumstantial evidence, was that his disappearance was not the result of a sale, but rather of an escape that had been facilitated by the same network of connections that had been discovered during the financial investigation. The psychological study of the case, conducted years later by physicians interested in understanding the mental health implications of slavery for both enslaved and enslaving populations, identified patterns that were consistent with what would later be recognized as complex trauma responses. The isolation, power imbalances, and moral contradictions inherent in the plantation system created conditions that could produce severe psychological disturbances in individuals from all social positions. The cultural impact of the Belmare case extended beyond the immediate geographical area through the network of family connections that linked Mobile County's elite to similar communities throughout the South. Letters and private journals from the period indicate that news of the scandal, however carefully suppressed locally, spread through these family networks and contributed to a broader discussion about the psychological and moral sustainability of the plantation system. The architectural evidence discovered at the plantation raised questions about the prevalence of hidden spaces and secret passages in antebellum houses throughout the region. Subsequent investigations revealed that many prominent families had incorporated similar features into their homes, suggesting either a common response to security concerns or coordination in preparation for activities that required concealment from outside observation. The medical understanding of the psychological conditions exhibited by both Mrs. Belmare and Isaac Thornton was limited by the scientific knowledge available in the 1840s, but Dr. Morton's detailed observations provided insights that would prove valuable to later researchers studying the psychological effects of extreme social stress. His notes described symptoms that would later be recognized as consistent with what modern psychology terms dissociative disorders and complex post-traumatic stress responses. The economic analysis of the plantation's operations during the period when the secret relationship was developing revealed patterns of resource allocation and management decisions that suggested the entire enterprise was being reorganized to support activities beyond normal agricultural production. The scale of these changes implied that whatever was occurring involved not just the immediate participants, but a broader network of individuals who were either directly involved or willingly ignorant of the true nature of the plantation's operations. The social network analysis of the families and individuals who were involved in managing the crisis revealed connections that extended throughout the Gulf Coast region and included relationships with merchants, ship captains, lawyers, and politicians whose influence reached into state and federal government. This network's ability to suppress information about the scandal demonstrated the extent to which antebellum Southern society was organized to protect the interests of its elite members, regardless of the moral or legal implications of their actions. The investigation into similar cases that may have occurred on other plantations throughout the region was necessarily limited by the same factors that had made the Belmar case difficult to document. However, fragmentary evidence from estate sales, medical records, and private correspondence suggests that the psychological and social pressures that had produced the crisis at Belmar Plantation existed throughout the plantation system and may have resulted in other situations that were resolved through similar private mechanisms. The long-term effects of the scandal on the individuals who were peripheral to the central events provide insight into the broader social impact of such crises. House servants who had been present during the investigation period were observed to exhibit behavioral changes that persisted for years afterward, suggesting that exposure to the breakdown of normal social boundaries had lasting psychological effects even on those who were not directly involved in the central relationship. The preservation of evidence related to the case occurred through informal networks of individuals who recognized the historical significance of what they had witnessed or discovered. Private journals, preserved letters, and oral traditions maintained within families provided sources of information that would have been otherwise lost through the systematic efforts to suppress official documentation of the events. The broader historical context of the Belmar case includes its occurrence during a period of increasing national tension over slavery and the future of the plantation system. The events at the plantation reflected many of the contradictions and psychological pressures that were building throughout Southern society during the 1840s, making the case representative of broader social and cultural forces that would ultimately contribute to the sectional conflicts of the following decades. The analysis of power dynamics within the plantation system, as revealed through the Belmar case, demonstrated the extent to which the entire social structure depended on maintaining strict boundaries between different groups of people. The breakdown of these boundaries, even in a single instance involving only a few individuals, threatened the psychological foundations upon which the entire system was based, explaining the extreme measures taken to suppress information about what had occurred. In the summer of 1868, more than 20 years after the events at Belmar Plantation, Dr. Morton's nephew discovered among his uncle's papers a sealed envelope containing what appeared to be additional documentation related to the case. The contents of this envelope, which included photographs and written statements that had never been shared with the original investigating committee, suggested that the true extent of what had occurred at the plantation had been even more complex than the already disturbing events that had been officially acknowledged. The photographic evidence, created using the early daguerreotype process that had recently become available in mobile during the 1840s, showed interior views of the hidden chambers that revealed details about their construction and furnishing that had not been included in previous descriptions. These images suggested that the spaces had been prepared for long-term occupation and had been equipped with amenities that indicated considerable planning and financial investment. The written statements, apparently recorded by Dr. Morton during private interviews with several participants in the events, contained information that contradicted some aspects of the official account while confirming others. Most significantly, these documents suggested that the relationship between Mrs. Bellemare and Isaac Thornton had been part of a larger pattern of relationships that had involved other members of both the family and the enslaved community over an extended period. The implications of this additional evidence were never fully explored, as Dr. Morton's nephew, recognizing the potential consequences of making such information public, chose to reseal the documents and place them in a bank vault in Montgomery. According to family records, these materials remained undisturbed until the bank's closure during the financial panic of 1893, when they were transferred to the state archives and subsequently lost during a fire that destroyed much of the collection in 1897. The oral traditions preserved within the African American community of Mobile County included references to the Bellemare plantation that provided a different perspective on the events than that contained in the official records. These accounts, collected by researchers during the 1930s as part of federal documentation projects, described Isaac Thornton as a figure who had achieved a level of education and sophistication that was unusual for someone in his position, and who had been involved in activities that extended far beyond his relationship with Mrs. Bellemare. The final documented reference to the Bellemare case appeared in a private letter written in 1874 by Augustus Pembroke to his son, who was studying law at the University of Alabama. In this letter, Pembroke reflected on the events he had witnessed as a young man and expressed his belief that the true story of what had occurred at the plantation would never be fully known, as too many people had been involved in suppressing the evidence and too much time had passed for accurate reconstruction of the facts. The letter concluded with Pembroke's observation that the psychological pressures that had produced the crisis at Bellemare Plantation continued to exist throughout Southern society, and that similar situations would inevitably occur as long as the fundamental contradictions of the social system remained unresolved. His prediction proved accurate, as subsequent decades revealed numerous cases of relationships and situations that challenged the rigid boundaries upon which antebellum society had been based. The transformation of the former plantation property continued through the remainder of the 19th century, with each successive generation of owners making changes that further obscured evidence of its troubled history. By the early 20th century, the land had been subdivided and converted to other uses, with only a few foundation stones and overgrown garden plots remaining to mark the location where one of Alabama's most disturbing and psychologically complex scandals had unfolded more than half a century earlier. Today, the site where the Bellemare plantation once stood is occupied by a residential subdivision with modern houses built over the foundations of slave quarters and cotton fields. The main house was demolished in 1912, and with it disappeared the physical evidence of the hidden chambers and secret passages that had played such a crucial role in the events of 1846 and 47. Yet, the questions raised by what occurred there continue to resonate, challenging our understanding of human nature under extreme social pressures and the mechanisms through which societies protect themselves from truths they are not prepared to acknowledge. The case of Isaac Thornton and the Bellemare family represents more than a historical curiosity or a tale of forbidden romance. It provides insight into the psychological and social forces that operated within the plantation system, revealing the extent to which that system depended not only on legal and economic coercion, but also on the suppression of human relationships that challenged its fundamental assumptions about race, power, and human worth. The psychological examination of surviving documentation from the period reveals patterns that suggest the Bellemare case was not an isolated incident, but rather a manifestation of tensions that existed throughout the plantation system. The careful documentation maintained by Dr. Morton, despite the efforts to suppress official records, provides insight into the mental health implications of a social system that demanded the complete dehumanization of one group of people while maintaining the moral respectability of another. The analysis of Mrs. Bellamare's condition, as recorded in Dr. Morton's private notes, revealed symptoms that were consistent with what modern psychology would recognize as a severe dissociative disorder. Her alternating periods of lucidity and confusion, her fragmented memories of events, and her inability to maintain consistent emotional responses suggested a mind that had been severely traumatized by circumstances that challenged her fundamental understanding of her own identity and social position. Isaac Thornton's psychological state, as observed during the brief period when he was accessible to Dr. Morton's examination, displayed characteristics that were equally complex but different in their manifestation. His responses to questions were measured and intelligent, but they revealed a man who had learned to navigate multiple realities simultaneously. His ability to present different aspects of his personality depending on the social context of the interaction suggested someone who had developed sophisticated psychological defense mechanisms in response to the impossible situation in which he found himself. The investigation into the plantation's financial records during the months leading up to the crisis revealed expenditures that could not be accounted for through normal operations. These mysterious transactions included payments to merchants in New Orleans, Mobile, and Charleston that suggested the acquisition of goods and services that were unrelated to cotton production or typical household needs. The nature of these purchases remained unclear, but their timing coincided with the period when the relationship between Mrs. Bellamere and Isaac Thornton was apparently developing. The role of literacy in the case became apparent through the discovery of written materials that demonstrated both participants possessed reading and writing skills that were unusual for their respective social positions. Mrs. Bellamare's education had been typical for a woman of her social class, but the depth of her written reflections on philosophical and moral questions exceeded what would have been expected from someone whose formal education had focused primarily on domestic accomplishments. Isaac Thornton's literacy, while dangerous for an enslaved person, had apparently been developed to a level that allowed him to engage with complex ideas and express himself with sophistication that challenged assumptions about intellectual capacity and racial hierarchy. The network of relationships that facilitated whatever activities were occurring at the plantation extended beyond the immediate participants to include individuals whose roles were never fully documented. References in various letters and journals suggest that house servants, field hands, overseers, and even some members of neighboring plantation families were aware of unusual circumstances at the Belmare property. The ability of this network to maintain secrecy during the crisis period and afterward demonstrated the extent to which Southern society was organized to protect information that threatened its fundamental assumptions. The medical treatment provided to Mrs. Belmare after her removal from the plantation involved techniques that were experimental for the period and reflected Dr. Morton's belief that her condition required approaches that went beyond conventional medical practice. His treatment notes described the use of hypnosis, extended conversation therapy, and carefully controlled social interactions designed to help her reconstruct memories that had become fragmented during the crisis period. The limited success of these treatments suggested that whatever she had experienced had effects that extended beyond the reach of available medical interventions. The search for Isaac Thornton after his disappearance from the plantation involved private investigators hired by the committee that had managed the crisis. Their reports, discovered among legal papers decades later, revealed a trail that led through multiple states but ended without definitive conclusions about his ultimate fate. Some evidence suggested that he had reached the north and achieved freedom, while other information indicated that he may have been recaptured and sold into the deep south under a different identity. The impact of the scandal on the enslaved community at Bellemere Plantation was documented through interviews conducted years later with individuals who had been present during the crisis period. Their accounts revealed that the breakdown of normal social boundaries had created both opportunities and dangers that affected the entire community. Some enslaved people reported that the period of chaos had allowed them to gain access to information and resources that were normally beyond their reach, while others described increased surveillance and punishment that made their lives more difficult. The architectural investigation of the hidden chambers revealed construction techniques and materials that suggested they had been built during the original construction of the house rather than added later. This discovery implied that the Bellemere family had planned for activities that required concealment from the time they first established the plantation. The sophistication of the hidden spaces, which included ventilation systems, concealed entrances and storage areas, suggested that they had been designed by someone with considerable expertise in such construction. The analysis of correspondence between plantation families throughout Mobile County during the months following the crisis revealed a pattern of increased communication that suggested the scandal had effects that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Letters between wives of prominent planters included coded references to increased vigilance in household management and subtle changes in the supervision of enslaved people that indicated widespread concern about the potential for similar situations to develop elsewhere. The legal precedents that might have applied to the case were never tested through formal proceedings, but private consultations among lawyers revealed significant uncertainty about how existing laws would address situations that challenged fundamental assumptions about race, consent, and power relationships. The consensus among legal professionals was that prosecution would have required testimony and evidence that could have undermined the legal foundations upon which the entire plantation system was based. The economic consequences of the scandal extended beyond the immediate sale of the plantation to affect business relationships throughout Mobile County. Several merchants and factors who had worked with the Bellemere family found their own reputations affected by association, leading to changes in business practices and social relationships that persisted for years afterward. The interconnected nature of the plantation economy meant that the effects of such scandals could spread rapidly through commercial networks. The cultural memory of the events was preserved through oral traditions that developed differently within various communities. The white planter families maintained a version that emphasized the tragic consequences of moral weakness and the importance of maintaining proper social boundaries. The enslaved community developed narratives that focused on resistance, survival, and the possibility of challenging oppressive systems through intelligence and determination. These different versions of the story reflected the perspectives and values of their respective communities. The psychological study of power relationships within plantation society, informed by the Bellemere case, revealed the extent to which the entire system depended on maintaining artificial distinctions between groups of people who were, in reality, far more similar than the social structure acknowledged. The breakdown of these distinctions, even in isolated cases, threatened the psychological foundations upon which individuals built their understanding of themselves and their place in society. The investigation into similar cases throughout the antebellum South, conducted by historians in the 20th century, revealed patterns that suggested the Bellemere case was part of a broader phenomenon that occurred wherever the contradictions of the plantation system created psychological pressures that exceeded individuals' ability to maintain the fiction of racial hierarchy. These cases were typically suppressed through mechanisms similar to those employed in Mobile County, making them difficult to document, but indicating that the underlying tensions were widespread. The preservation of evidence related to the case occurred through informal networks of individuals who recognized its historical significance. Private collections maintained by families, medical records preserved by physicians, and oral traditions maintained within communities provided sources of information that survived the systematic efforts to suppress official documentation. These informal preservation efforts were motivated by various factors, including historical curiosity, moral outrage, and recognition that the events represented important evidence about the nature of American society during the antebellum period. The final resolution of questions surrounding the case remained elusive, even decades after the events had occurred. The death of key participants, the destruction of documents, and the passage of time made definitive reconstruction of what had happened impossible. However, the fragmentary evidence that survived provided sufficient detail to demonstrate that the relationship between Isaac Thornton and Lucinda Bellemare had been part of a complex web of human interactions that challenged every assumption about race, power, and morality that governed antebellum Southern society. The broader historical significance of the Bellemare case lies not in its uniqueness, but in its representation of tensions that existed throughout the plantation system. The psychological pressures that produced the crisis at that particular plantation were present wherever human beings were reduced to property and forced to live in close proximity to those who claimed to own them. The artificial nature of racial hierarchy, the moral contradictions of slavery, and the psychological costs of maintaining such a system created conditions that inevitably produced situations that challenged its fundamental assumptions. The legacy of what occurred at Bellemare Plantation continued to influence Mobile County society for generations after the immediate participants had died or disappeared. The mechanisms developed to suppress information about the scandal became models for handling similar crises, while the questions raised about human nature and social organization continued to resonate through subsequent decades of social change. The Civil War, which began 14 years after the Bellemare crisis, brought many of these underlying tensions to the surface and forced American society to confront contradictions that had previously been managed through suppression and denial. In the end, the case of Isaac Thornton and the Bellemare family serves as a window into the psychological and social dynamics that operated within one of the most oppressive systems ever established in American history. The fragmentary evidence that survived the systematic efforts to suppress documentation provides insight into the human costs of slavery that extended far beyond the physical suffering that has been more widely documented. The psychological trauma experienced by both enslaved and enslaving populations, the moral corruption that resulted from treating human beings as property, and the social mechanisms developed to maintain such a system all contributed to a legacy that continued to influence American society long after slavery was officially abolished. The questions raised by what occurred at Bellemare Plantation in 1846 and 47 remain relevant to understanding how societies create and maintain systems of oppression, how individuals respond to impossible moral situations, and how communities protect themselves from truths that challenge their fundamental assumptions about human nature and social organization. The psychological complexity revealed through this case demonstrates that the reality of slavery was far more complicated than either its defenders or its critics typically acknowledged, involving forms of human interaction that defied the simple categories through which the institution was usually understood. And perhaps most disturbingly, the efficiency with which Mobile County society suppressed information about what had occurred at the plantation demonstrated the extent to which American communities were organized to protect systems of oppression from challenge or exposure. The network of individuals who participated in covering up the scandal included doctors, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants, and religious leaders whose cooperation ensured that questions about the moral and psychological sustainability of slavery would not be raised through public examination of such cases. The silence that surrounded the Belmar case for more than a century after it occurred was not simply the result of social embarrassment or concern for individual reputations. It reflected a systematic effort to prevent public discussion of evidence that revealed the true nature of slavery as a system that corrupted everyone it touched, regardless of their position within its hierarchy. Until that silence was finally broken by historians willing to examine fragmentary evidence and piece together incomplete documentation, the full human cost of slavery remained hidden behind a veil of deliberate ignorance that served the interests of those who preferred not to confront the moral implications of their society's foundational institution. Today, more than 170 years after Isaac Thornton and Lucinda Bellemere encountered each other on that Mobile County plantation, their story serves as a reminder that the most profound truths about human experience often remain hidden beneath the official narratives that societies create to protect themselves from uncomfortable realities. The psychological complexity, moral ambiguity, and social trauma revealed through their case continue to challenge our understanding of how human beings respond to systems of oppression and how communities organize themselves to maintain such systems despite their obvious moral contradictions. The echo of what occurred during those cold winter months of 1846 and 47 can still be heard in the questions we continue to ask about power, race, and human relationships in American society. The mechanisms of suppression and denial that were employed to manage the Bellemere scandal established patterns that persisted long after slavery was abolished, influencing how subsequent generations addressed evidence of systemic oppression and social injustice. The case reminds us that the most important stories are often the ones that societies work hardest to forget, and that understanding the full complexity of our history requires the courage to examine evidence that challenges our preferred narratives about who we are and how we became that way.